Welcome to Anews. I'm Umar Taslim, and you're watching Turkey's Diplomacy. From Ukraine's battlefield shifts to rising transatlantic tensions and from Black Sea power plays to global trade upheavals, today we'll break down the major geopolitical and economic flashpoints reshaping the world. As NATO ramps up arms for Ukraine and Trump threatens sweeping tariffs, what's at stake for Europe, Turkey and global markets? Joining me to analyze these latest developments are Anews editor Mustafa Kocakenar and Laurent Lecoux, founder of the Macro Butler.
We will send them Patriots.
In a major policy shift, US President Donald Trump has announced a fresh wave of missiles and weaponry for Ukraine, including Patriot air defense missiles, which Ukraine urgently wants to fend off daily Russian missile and drone attacks.
He talks nice and then he bombs everybody in the evening.
Although the exact number of Patriots is unknown, Trump was clear that the European Union would pay for them. The Patriot, short for Phased Array Tracking Radar for Intercept on Target, is a mobile surface-to-air missile defense system. It was developed by Raytheon Technologies and is capable of intercepting aircraft, tactical ballistic and cruise missiles. It's considered one of the most advanced air defense systems in the US arsenal and has been in service since the 1980s. A typical battery includes radar and control systems, a powerful unit, launchers, and support vehicles. According to Raytheon's website, it has built and delivered over 240 Patriot fire units, which have been shipped to 19 countries, including Germany, Japan, and Egypt. How it works depends on the type of interceptor used. The earlier PAC-2 interceptor uses a blast fragmentation warhead that detonates in the vicinity of a target, while the PAC-3 family of missiles uses more accurate technology that hits the target directly. It's not clear what kind of Patriot systems have been donated to Ukraine, but it's likely that Kiev has at least some of the newer models. According to NATO, the system's radar has a range of over 93 miles, or 150 kilometers. A newly produced single Patriot battery costs more than $1 billion, which includes $400 million for the system and $690 million for the missiles in a battery. That's according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which says Patriot interceptors are estimated to cost around $4 million per missile. In January, Axios reported that the US had transferred about 90 Patriot interceptors from Israel to Ukraine. Ukrainian officials say they're essential to defend key targets from Russia's escalating long-range attacks. But Russia says it sees the Patriots as a direct escalation, and as in the past, said supplying more would delay the chances of peace.
Welcome back to the program. Anews editor Mustafa Kocakenar, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Omar.
Mustafa, let's start with the Patriot systems, and the United States says that it's going to supply those air defense missiles and those systems to Ukraine. Now, Mustafa, there's a problem. NATO members, some of them, are saying that they're going to be a part of it. For example, Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands have said that they're going to take part in this aid mission by the United States. Now, there's one country, the Czech Republic, which is saying that it's not going to participate in this NATO program. How are these NATO allies, Mustafa, going to unite and send these weapons and these equipments to Ukraine when we're seeing that there are some challenges within the NATO alliance?
Omar, during his presidential campaign last year, Donald Trump promised to end war between Ukraine and Russia within 24 hours. And we know that Trump started his second term at White House in January, and right now we are in July, and it has passed 6 months, and right now the war is still continuing between Ukraine and Russia, and it is clearly showing that Donald Trump failed to deliver his foreign policy promises during his presidential campaign. And since the very beginning of his second term, Trump administration has been pushing for immediate ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia and the cessation of the ongoing conflicts in the Eastern Europe. But we know that both Russia and Ukraine are determined to increase their military activities in the region to reach their political goals. We know that Trump initiated dialogue and diplomacy between Ukrainian and Russian delegations to discuss what can be done in terms of reaching a ceasefire or peace deal. As you know, Istanbul also hosted several rounds of peace negotiations between two sides. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio represented the Trump administration during these talks. But I think that right now Trump announced his new strategy to bring back both Ukraine and Russia to the negotiating table. I think that Trump learned something from crisis between Israel and Iran. As you know, last month Israel launched unprecedented and major airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, military installations, and oil infrastructure. Israel desperately needed United States help to obliterate Iran's nuclear program. And Trump administration decided to join Israel's military campaign against Israel, and United States bombed Iran's nuclear facilities. Then the American airstrikes paved the way for the ceasefire between Iran and Israel in the Middle East. I think Trump learned something from that crisis, and it is the coercive diplomacy. Right now, Trump is escalating the situation to de-escalate the geopolitical tensions between Russia and Ukraine. United States is set to send Patriot missile systems to Ukraine because we know that Ukrainian army desperately need Patriot missile systems to defend the Ukrainian cities against Russian air strikes. On the other hand, Russia is also warning the United States against sending Patriot systems to Ukraine. Kremlin is claiming that this decision will prolong the war between two sides in the region. On the other hand, European nations will take the responsibility in terms of sending Patriot missile systems to Ukraine. Some European allies within the North Atlantic Treaty organizations are reaffirming their strong support for Ukraine's territorial integrity and political sovereignty. And Trump claimed that these European nations will share the responsibility in terms of protecting Ukraine against Russian strikes. I think that United States is also pursuing a backpassing strategy right now. We will see how the situation will evolve into the peace or wider war. I think that Trump administration is continuing to escalate the situation to bring back Russia to the negotiating table to strike a ceasefire deal or sustainable peace deal.
Well, so the NATO chief met President Trump in the last few hours. Now, there's a 40 billion package that we're talking about, which the NATO will facilitate for Ukraine. What is going to be Russia's response when, now that it knows that the United States is going to dispatch those Patriot defense systems? How is Russia going to react to this statement?
Mar, as you know, last month in Netherlands Hague, NATO leaders gathered to discuss regional and international security challenges. And Trump praised the unity and solidarity among NATO members to deal with the security challenges posed by Russia in Europe. But we know that Trump is also engaging with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, to discuss the bilateral relations between Washington and Moscow and exchange regional and international security developments. But Trump is always expressing his frustration over Putin's reluctance to reach ceasefire deal with Ukraine. As we mentioned that Russia is also warning the United States against the escalation in Ukraine. Kremlin is always claiming that Patriot missile systems will prolong the war between Ukraine and Russia. Russia, as you know, is calling upon Ukraine to give up its territorial integrity and national sovereignty. On the other hand, Ukrainian side is always asking for the full withdrawal of Russian forces from the occupied territory. And it is clearly showing that right now there are different demands coming from both sides. I think these different security demands need to be reconciled by the regional or international stakeholders. I don't think that Russia will count on the Western's facilitator role or mediation role in terms of putting an end to the ongoing conflicts in the region. I think it is up to Turkey right now, because we know that Turkey has been enjoying close relationships with both Ukraine and Russia. I think Turkey can play an important role between Russia and Ukraine, or between Russia and the United States, to de-escalate the geopolitical situation. Turkey has been always calling for leader-to-leader diplomacy to accelerate the diplomatic efforts in terms of halting war between two warring sides in the region. I think if the international community wants to see a long-standing and sustainable peace and tranquility in Eastern Europe, they will supposed to take Turkey's security demands into the consideration.
Mustafa, we know about Turkey's role in this war between Ukraine and Russia, and we've seen how Turkey has helped to, bring this war to an end. We've seen the grain deal, we've seen the exchange of prisoners of war, and we've seen negotiations being held not just in Istanbul, but also in other cities, for example, Ankara and Antalya. Now, Mustafa, what I want to ask you about is the EU's Black Sea strategy, which was released in May. How important is Turkey's role in safeguarding maritime security in the Black Sea?
Mar, we know that Russia started its special military operation against Ukraine in 2022 February. And since then, Turkey has been taking important diplomatic steps to de-escalate the geopolitical tensions in the region. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan have been in close contact with their both Ukrainian and Russian counterparts to discuss the possible terms in terms of reaching ceasefire deal or peace deal. And within this context, Turkey's Ankara and Istanbul and Antalya hosted important meetings between Ukrainian and Russian delegations. It is clearly showing that Turkey is playing an important role in terms of ensuring peace and tranquility in the region. On the other hand, we know that Turkey is controlling the Black Sea thanks to the Montreux Convention. And since the very beginning of the geopolitical tensions between two warring sides in the Black Sea, Turkey has been always calling for regional solutions for regional problems. And Turkey has been strengthening its ties with regional stakeholders in the region. I mean Bulgaria and Romania. And right now, Turkey, Bulgaria and Romania are strengthening their collaboration and cooperation to ensure and uphold peace and tranquility in the region, because these countries think that if there is something wrong in the Black Sea, it will spread the cause to the other parts of the Europe or world, and it will pose a huge threat to international peace and security. Right now, the European Union is also determined to strengthen its ties with Turkey to discuss what can be done in terms of bringing long-standing and sustainable peace to the region. They are also unveiling their maritime peace strategy, and Turkey can play an important role between two warring sides in the region. I think that Turkey's position will be determined by the Turkish decision makers in terms of ensuring peace and tranquility in the Black Sea. I hope that all regional and international stakeholders will continue to cooperate with Turkey in the region.
Mustafa, you just said that this war has been affecting many countries, especially European countries. And we saw as well when the war started, and many European countries were impacted because they were using Russian energy, especially Germany. We saw what happened with Germany. Germany was using Russian gas, Russian energy, and then it started, moving to other countries and using other sources. But when we talk about sanctions, how effective are these sanctions? We just saw a few days ago, the European Union launched imposed new sanctions on Russia's energy sector. So, Mustafa, how are these sanctions going to impact European countries? Because we know that some countries and some economies are reliant on Russian assets, Russian energy sectors, and other Russian areas as well that help them become a huge economy. So how important are these sanctions going to be for Europe? And do you think that these sanctions are going to escalate the tensions, or is there going to be any resolvement between these countries?
Umar, as you know, following Russia's special military operation in Ukraine, Western countries decided to impose heavy sanctions on Russia. But we know that Europe is depending on the Russian energy to keep the countries alive, politically alive in the region. And it is clearly poisoning the bilateral relationships between Russia and European countries. We know that Germany desperately depends on the Russia's energy assets, and it is clearly imposing economic effects on German economy. On the other hand, we know that the United States is always calling for more sanctions on Russia to bring the Russian decision makers to the negotiating table to strike a ceasefire deal. We know that Trump has recently threatened Russia with 100% tariffs if they don't sign ceasefire deal within 50 days. It is crystal clear that tit-for-tat actions between Russia and Western countries are continuing via Sanctions Act. I think that Russia is always calling for the removal of sanctions on its energy sector and economic system, because Russia is also suffering from the Western sanctions. I think that both Russia and the Western countries will be supposed to find a common way or common sense if they don't want to escalate geopolitical tensions and if they want to see peace and tranquility in the region.
Well, so tell me about the overall situation right now between Europe and the United States. There are many disagreements, for example, the war in Gaza, the war in Ukraine, then there are trade tariffs as well. So how are you looking at the overall situation and the current relationship between both of these sides?
Umar, as you know, Trump's some diplomatic actions sparked fears among European allies within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization over American security commitment to Europe. As you know, Trump is always calling on European nations to take more responsibility to protect the country from the security threats posed by Russia. Trump, as you know, at the end of February, diplomatically humiliated Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky with his Vice President J.D. Vance in front of the international media. Trump also threatened to suspend military aid for Ukraine, and it sparked fears among European nations. And European Union right now is determined to create its own army to deal with the security challenges in the old continent. And it is clearly showing that there is a transatlantic rift between the United States and European allies. But we know that Turkey can play an important role between two sides of the Atlantic, because Turkey has been always enjoying close relationships with its Western allies. At the end, on the sidelines of the NATO summit, we know that Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan met with his American counterpart Donald Trump and some European leaders, including German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and French President Emmanuel Macron. Turkey is always expressing its readiness to hold talks between two sides to de-escalate the geopolitical crisis or geopolitical tensions. But I think that Donald Trump will continue to pursue America First foreign policy to secure American national interest and national security worldwide. And it will clearly pose a huge threat to transatlantic bond among nations and among allies within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I think that Turkey can be considered as an important ally in terms of ensuring diplomatic talks among NATO allies, and Turkey, I think, can continue to facilitate or mediate any talks between United States and European nations in terms of discussing what can be done to strengthen transatlantic bonds.
Musa, thanks for that analysis. We'll be right back with you. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan led nationwide commemorations marking the 9th anniversary of the July 15 defeated coup attempt, honoring the martyrs who sacrificed their lives defending Turkey's democracy.
O gece Cihan Şumul kardeşliğimizin sırrına bir kez daha vakıf olduk. Türkiye'nin Türkiye'den büyük olduğu hakikati 15 Temmuz gecesi bir kez daha hem de çok güçlü bir şekilde anlaşılmıştır.
Türkiye is commemorating the victims of the July 15, 2016 defeated coup attempt carried out by the Gulenist terror group.
Pakistan'dan Endonezya'ya, Bosna'dan Somali'ye binlerce kilometre ötede eller Türkiye için, Türkiye'nin selameti, kurtuluşu için semaya kalktı. Dualar bizim için edildi. Kur'anlar bizim için okundu. Dost ve kardeşlerimiz dualarıyla direnişlerimize, gözyaşlarıyla zaferimize ortak oldular.
Since its official designation in October 2016, every year the nation marks July 15th as Democracy and National Unity Day, with events held nationwide to honor those who lost their lives resisting the putschists and to remember the bravery of the people.
Milletimiz göğsünü kurşunlara siper ederek sadece hain darbeyi boşa çıkarmakla kalmamış, aynı zamanda bir işgal girişimini de püskürtmüştür.
The coup attempt, orchestrated by the US-based Fethullah Gulen and his followers, left more than 250 people dead and 2,734 others injured. Ankara accuses the group of waging a long-running campaign to overthrow the state by infiltrating key Turkish institutions, particularly the military, police, and judiciary.
Son nefesini 60 bin kilometre ötede vatansız olarak verdikten sonra tam da cibilliyetine yakışır şekilde bir çukura atılan FETÖ elebaşının kurduğu tuzak 15 Temmuz gecesi milletimizin dik duruşuyla, cesur duruşuyla, kahramanca direnişiyle darmadağın olmuştur.
The coup attempt began around 10 p.m. local time on July 15, 2016 and was thwarted by 8 a.m. the following morning. Standing firm in the face of the threat, the Turkish people demonstrated to the world that they would not tolerate any effort to undermine their will or disrupt their democratically elected government.
Terörsüz Türkiye, terörsüz bölgeye giden sürecin kilidini açacak. Türkiye yüzyılının inşası daha da hızlanacak. Çok kutuplu dünyada Türkiye'miz yeni bir kutup başı olarak inşallah hak ettiği yeri alacaktır.
Welcome back to the program. Now let's take a look at the top headline from Daily Sabah. Musa, we were just listening to Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. We marked the 9th anniversary of the 2016 coup, where 251 people were killed, more than 2,000 people were wounded. How is Turkey proceeding, Mustafa, with the Terror-Free Turkey initiative?
Omar, as you mentioned, Turkey commemorated the 9th anniversary of the coup attempt by the Fethullah terrorist organization, and 9 years ago, Turkish nation and Turkish security forces foiled the coup attempt by the Gülenist terrorists, because FETÖ was targeting Turkish nation's political will and Turkey's democracy. But thanks Allah, with the support coming from the Turkish nation and Turkish armed forces, Turkey successfully foiled a coup attempt by the FETÖ members. And right now, Turkey is praising the international support for its in its fight against terrorism, especially with Daesh, PKK and Fethullah terror group. Yesterday, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan also hailed some nations, particularly Pakistan, for their strong support for Turkey's struggle against terrorist groups. On the other hand, as you know, last year, Turkey's opposition Nationalist Movement Party leader, Devlet Bahçeli, initiated Terror-Free Turkey initiative. And we know that last week, some PKK members decided to lay down their weapons in northern Iraq's Süleymaniye province. It is clearly showing that Turkey is taking some important steps to realize the government's Terror-Free Turkey initiative. On the other hand, right now, Turkish security forces and Turkish National Intelligence Organization are meticulously following the latest developments about the disarmament process of the PKK terror group. Turkish Parliament will establish a commitment to monitor the latest developments about the dissolution of the PKK terror group. Right now, it is projected that the Terror-Free Turkey initiative will accelerate a process for the government to realize the Century of Turkey vision.
Mustafa, thanks for that analysis.
You are welcome, Mar.
Now let's take a look at this news report, and we'll be right back.
Absolutely unacceptable and unjustified.
That was the reaction from EU ministers to a 30% tariff on European goods threatened by US President Donald Trump.
So if this is a situation, we have to protect the jobs, we have to protect the businesses, we have to protect EU economy, and we need to go for these rebalancing measures.
Trade Commissioner Maros Sefcovic will talk with US Trade Representative Jameson Greer on Tuesday with the looming August 1st deadline set by the American leader. EU ministers meeting in Brussels on Monday remained convinced they can bring Trump back from the brink and reach a deal that would keep the $1.7 trillion two-way trading relationship broadly intact. Some in the EU said they would not be intimidated. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said the US should not underestimate Europe's willingness to respond to excessively high tariffs with similar measures. Last year, the United States accounted for a fifth of all EU exports, its largest partner. Trump's complaint is the $235 billion U.S. deficit in goods traded with Europe, even though the U.S. earns a surplus on services. The impact of making European exports, from pharmaceuticals to autos, machinery, or wine, too expensive to be viable for American consumers, would be instantly tangible.
Trump has threatened to impose 30% tariffs on all EU exports to the US, so that would affect the pharmaceutical sector, so that's one thing.
Peter Bay Kierkegaard is the head of trade policy at a Danish industry group. He said Danish pharmaceutical companies, including industry giant Novo Nordisk, maker of weight loss drug Wegovy and diabetes medication Ozempic, could be hit. Some have argued the standoff with Trump is what the EU needs to complete long-delayed reforms of its single market, boosting domestic demand, and rebalancing its economy away from the exports, which account for around half of output.
Welcome back to the program. Joining us now from Singapore is Laurent Lecoux. He is the founder of the Macro Butler. Laurent, welcome to the program.
It's my pleasure to be on your show, Umar.
Laurent, let's start with the tariffs that President Donald Trump has said he is going to impose by the 1st of August on the European Union and Mexico. What sort of a retaliation could that bring from these two bodies?
Well, I think that the situation is a bit different between the EU and Mexico. So if I start with the EU is already in a dire domestic economic environment and was probably surviving only thanks to its exports. So clearly the tariff imposed on EU goods into the US will threaten economic growth in the region. On the other hand, the EU is also under pressure from importing cheap goods, especially from China and from other countries in emerging markets. So it is clear that the EU is in a weak position in terms of negotiating with Donald Trump in the next few days before the August 1st deadline. On the other hand, Mexico is holding a bit more cards than the EU because the US economy is highly dependent on Mexican imports for a lot of parts, especially in the automotive sector. So I would think that Mexico has much more bargaining power against Trump than the EU. And also the EU will feel the pressure of potential increased sanction against Russia, as well as renewed tension in the Ukraine-Russia war, and of course the problem of the Middle East, where the EU import most of its gas and oil.
Laurent, tell me, how important are the sanctions that Donald Trump is going to impose on Russia and its trading partners? He has said that he could impose 100% sanctions on Russia's trading partners and on Russia if the ceasefire is not reached between Ukraine and Russia. So how important do you think these sanctions could be for the United States and for the entire world in order to end the war in Ukraine?
Well, I guess that the tariff, the 100% tariff and the new sanction against Russia are kind of new tariff. It's kind of what we could call it a political tariff. In fact, we have seen the same of political tariff against Brazil last week. So the impact on the Russian economy is not that much. Russia doesn't really export anything much to the US outside some uranium. And the impact for the rest of the world, clearly, once again, the EU is likely to still be the most impacted because some European countries are still highly dependent on Russian oil and Russian gas, even after almost 3 years of sanction. And all this could play out on Russian partner. I guess that we have seen last week in Rio that the BRICS are getting closer together against the US. So I think that by imposing sanctions on Russia or imposing additional tariff on those countries who are still trade partners of Russia, this will only increase the homogeneity among the BRICS. This will most likely reinforce the BRICS group. And once again, at the end of the day, this is another tailwind to increase trade relationship, especially between Russia, China, and India. So, in fact, by trying to impose this kind of new sanction or political tariff on Russia and Russian trading partners, in fact, Donald Trump contribute to strengthening the Russia-China India axis. When it will be combined, and this would create the new economic power of the world by the next decade.
Laurent, tell me about the Big Beautiful Bill Act that was signed into law earlier this month. Now, what sort of social and economic problems could that bring in the United States?
Well, if I may, I would say that it was a big, beautiful joke. Because, in fact, the Big Beautiful Bill, of course, will only penalize the tax cut that were decided under Trump 1.0, but it will mostly increase the deficit. It will probably push the U.S. Treasury to borrow an additional $1 to $2 trillion on top of the $7 trillion it has to refinance by the end of this year. So this will create, I would say, an increased supply of U.S. treasuries at a time where demand is clearly constrained. And once again, we come back to the geopolitical situation by imposing tariff and by imposing sanction against BRICS countries. In fact, the U.S. is cutting itself from potential buyers of treasuries. So the Big Beautiful Bill, I would say, is far from being so beautiful. And at the end of the day, it will mean most likely that U.S. banks, U.S. insurance companies, and also U.S. stable coins. I think that the Genius Act is important. We'll need to fill the gap in terms of demand of U.S. treasuries. So if I can summarize the bill, in fact, I think that it contributes to increasingly polarize the world and is kind of in line with the recent decision of Donald Trump to impose a new round of tariff against the global south and mostly the BRICS countries.
Laurent, we were talking about the sanctions on the EU and on Mexico. Now, for example, tell me, if there are more sanctions on, for example, let's say Europe or Asian countries or European countries, do you think that that would allow, for example, regional trade agreements where we see blocks all across the world? For example, ASEAN, there's BRICS, there's the EU. Do you think that they will enhance or increase these regional trade agreements to, make the most out of these deals?
Well, I think that this will reinforce the trade relationship, especially among the countries of the global south. Unfortunately, for Europe, I don't think that the EU is really interested to cut its ties from the US and to enter a new trade relationship with the BRICS or with ASEAN. And here it's because the EU remain highly dependent from the US, especially to get a possible solution to the Ukraine-Russia conflict, as well as the EU has no other source of supply for its energy outside the Middle East than US natural gas. So I think to answer your question, I would think that this would reinforce the relationship inside the global south between BRICS countries, ASEAN countries. But for the EU, in fact, the EU will get increasingly isolated. And of course, this comes at a time where the bloc itself has to face domestic pressure. Economic data in Germany are on the dire side. So I think that a lot of challenges for the EU are piling ahead. And I would think that the future of the EU, of the euro, is quite gruesome in the next few months and years.
Laurent, how are you analyzing China's moves right now? Because we've seen China has good ties with the EU, with Russia, not such good ties with the United States. So how is China monitoring all these developments?
Well, I think that China, as it has been the case since Trump 1.0, has tried to find new trading partners. Yes, it's right that China is also trying to sell more goods into the EU, but I think that it's quite much more difficult for China to sell more goods to the EU rather than to sell more goods to ASEAN countries and other member of the BRICS, of the Belt Road Initiative. I think that for China, time is on China's side. I mean, there's no election in China. People must also remember that we are less than 18 months away of the midterm election. So this is not really the case for China. China is like a 5-10 year time horizon, and as it has done since 2017, it keeps reorganizing its supply chain and increase trade relationship with countries inside the Belt Road Initiative, the BRICS, as well as ASEAN countries. And I think that if we look ahead, I mean, behind the end of this decade and the 2030 decade, we will be in a world where China mostly trades with its BRICS and ASEAN partner, and where the US and also Europe have become, I would say, irrelevant trade partner of China.
Laurent, thank you for being on the program and for your analysis. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Anews editor Mustafa Kocakinar, thank you for being with us today and for your analysis as well.
You are welcome.
That brings us to the end of our program. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.